you're not going to let him come with us. He's different. And Jesus looks at Peter and says to him, and I love the line, get used to different. And I think these are the times we're living in. And if we have this sense of wanting it, whatever normal might look like, to be the ongoing story of our life, get used to different. Because I think as we think about following Christ in these times in which we live, as we sang that song, Build My Life, it's on him. And it gives us opportunities to continually discover things about ourselves. Because we like it all together, don't we? Come on, let's admit it. We like things perfectly. We like it all together. We don't want anything to challenge us. We want it smooth. We want it easy peasy. And we find ourselves in times that are not like that. It'd be one thing if it was a pandemic, and then we got the whole political thing going on, and now we've got the governor deciding what we do and what we don't do. So may you remember these words of Jesus. Get used to different, because it's an opportunity for us to discover Christ in ways maybe we never pressed into. And so pressing into him in these different times is what we're faced with doing. So we've been on this journey with the book of Judges. I started in July thinking about Judges, and we started talking about it because we recognize that in these times, especially as we got to the 4th of July and what freedom represented to our forefathers, freedom was being changed. And we began to look at Judges because we saw the theme in the book of Judges as everybody was doing what's right in their own eyes, and there was no authority in the land. If you get one thing out of the book of Judges, draw that parallel between the book of Judges and the times in which we live as we redefine freedom and call it autonomy in a way that no longer allows us to fulfill the purpose for which God was created us, but everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes, and the boundaries that are established in a world where everybody does what's right in their own eyes are their own personal boundaries. And so we fail to recognize the order of God. And in the book of Judges, that order that God created so that those individuals would experience freedom was an order that was going to help them to flourish in such a way that they would enjoy the promised land, that they would experience God's blessing in their life, and then in turn, because God loves the world, they would be a blessing to the Canaanites. And when we look at the book of Judges in the context of the narrative, we see how patient God has been with these Israelites. The other day I was reading a chapter out of a book called Everybody Always, and Bob Goff was talking about a period of time where he carried a metal bucket around with him on planes, in cars, in the subway, wherever he went, and it was his reminder to be patient. And he tells a story in it that one of the times he was speaking at a church and he was doing a lot of flying, and he was trying to get home because he would always fly home for dinner, and he was trying to get home, and the line at the rental return place for the car was really long, and the guy that was getting them through seemed to be dilly-dallying, and it was just, he was getting upset. And so as he sat there and looked over every once in a while, the passenger was the metal bucket that he was carrying around with him to be patient. His impatience was seeming to get the better of him. And so finally, he had already missed his plane. He wasn't going to get home for dinner. He hadn't even got out of the rental car yet. And he got up to the line, and he wanted to sort of communicate a few of his thoughts to the attendant that was bringing people through the line. And when he got there, he got out of the car, and the fellow who was doing it said, "Oh, Mr. Goff, I really liked the church service this morning." And he realized that all of these thoughts that he was having towards this guy, he started to realize, oh, he just heard me speak, and I wonder if who I am in real life is the same thing as what I have to say. And I think when we find out about God in terms of his long suffering over 300, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 years, how long suffering God has been with us. And that's where we find him in the book of Judges. So now we're coming to this last judge, the last sort of major judge. There are 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. And the last one is Samson. And we talked about him last week, and we left Samson once again exhausted from battling with 3,000 Philistines with a jawbone and up in a cave, dehydrated, complaining once again, thirsty because of him spending all of this energy in the flesh, and God comes to him and provides him with water. And once again, we see the dilemma that each and every one of us faces is our own sinfulness and God's incredible grace. And so what we see in Judges is what we see in all of us. We see in all of us this impatience. We see all of us this sinfulness. We see in all of us this wanting to take things into our own hands, even though we, like Samson, have experienced that supernatural, miraculous new birth that comes as a result of us looking to God for that forgiveness and that grace that enables us to be born again through the Spirit and to begin to live differently. And even though that's happened to some of us, maybe all of us, we recognize, like the Apostle Paul, that doesn't necessarily mean every time I want to do good, I do good. And it doesn't mean every time I don't want to do good, I don't do that either. And so Paul cries out, even in his place of following Christ, who will deliver me? And it's this grace of God. And so we find Moses in this place while receiving the grace of God. We come to the 16th chapter of the book of Judges. And as I was thinking about Samson and in the story, I thought about another man who had everything. He was the child that so many in the African community aspired to be. He had the world by the tail, if you will. I remember as a kid watching him on TV and just, if you were into sports and you played out in the playground, everybody oftentimes took on the name of a professional athlete. So one day you'd be Joe Bellino, another day you'd be Roger Staubach, and one day you'd be Bob Cousy or Larry Bird. But you're always playing, and I'm Larry Bird today. And so this was an individual that people just aspire to. And when I thought about him, I thought so much about Samson and how, oh, the mighty have fallen, and how Proverbs says that pride goes before the fall. So if you show the video, you'll see who this man is. You remember that commercial? Go, OJ, go, OJ, go, OJ. And then a little while later, you see him going in this white Bronco down the road, and you're wondering, whatever happened to him? And I couldn't help think about, how many aspired to be like him. And when we look at Samson, certainly in terms of that miraculous birth, where the angel of the Lord comes and speaks to his mom, and he's born, and then that miraculous vow, that sense of being consecrated to the Lord, right? Separated to the Lord, realizing both in terms of what that vow represented, in terms of not getting close to dead animals, not drinking fermented wine, and not cutting your hair. And we see this slippery slope that Samson finds himself on. He's already given himself over to the lusts of the flesh. We've seen him already take honey from a dead carcass. We've seen him participate in this drunken feast before he has experience of marrying the woman he ends up not marrying. And then we see catastrophe over and over and over again. And I can't help believe that there are times in all of our lives where we experience that. And so we come to chapter 16, and let me begin to read to you because I think it's really applicable as we look at his life and understand the heartache that is around him. And so chapter 16 and verse 1 says this: One day Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. What's interesting, do you remember the first words of Samson? We find them back in chapter 14. The very first words of Scripture that Samson utters after the Nazirite vow, everything that God had provided for him, were these words: I have seen a Philistine woman, now go get her for me. So it's interesting, as Samson comes on the scene, you already see him engaged in the lust of the flesh in ways that completely diminishes or even placates the fact that God has called him with this most supernatural birth and this calling to be a deliverer for Israel, but Samson is simply occupied with meeting his own needs. In many ways, Samson lives like a 21st century individual who does what's right in their own eyes. And he finds himself wanting to meet his needs rather than fulfilling God's purpose. And God is obviously created all of us, Samson included, for human flourishing. That's been God's plan from the beginning when he gives Adam and Eve the joy of walking with him in the garden. And then he calls Abraham to be the father of a nation that would experience the blessing of the promised land. And that each and every one of us created in the image of God for the sole purpose of not only experiencing the reality of the Trinity and all that that represents, but to experience this sense of God's reality, God's order, God's flourishing that comes as a result of living our life according to God's purpose for us. So not doing what's right in our own eyes, but doing what's right in God's eyes. Because only when we fulfill the very purpose for which we've been created and recreated and redeemed and sustained will we experience this thing called flourishing, this thing called peace, this thing called harmony with our environment, with our brothers and sisters. Only when we love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves. But Samson's sole endeavor in life, his first words and maybe even his last words, I saw the woman, go get her. And so in this very first part, Samson, after being delivered again and having his thirst quenched, and he didn't realize that only when God is the source of quenching our thirst will we really be satisfied. And so Samson goes out and finds himself in this place. Instead of trusting God for the fullness of what human flourishing looks like, Samson once again goes down to Gaza and finds the prostitute. And I couldn't help but think, when Paul writes to the Corinthians, a church that was filled with all kinds of struggle, he writes to them in the first book, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. But he says, all these things that I say to you, as he relates it to the reality of the children of God in the wilderness. He says this: these things happened to them, meaning the children of Israel in the wilderness, what we're talking about now, and were written down as warnings for us. It says, on whom the culmination of the ages, he says, upon whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. And so when we read about Samson, when we read about Ehud, when we read about Gideon, when we read about Jephthah, and all of these different individuals. We read, Paul says, about them so that we would learn from them to not repeat their mistakes. And yet at the same time, Paul says, there is no temptation that has taken you or me that is not common to man. So what does he really mean there? Because we're tempted differently. One person might be tempted to drink. Another person might be tempted to immorality. Another person might be tempted to the greed and the love of money. Another person might be tempted for prestige. But what is the common temptation? Nothing other than this, that we all want to be like God without God. That each and every one of us falls prey to the sin of self-absorption and thinking that we can provide ourselves with what it is that is necessary for both security and significance. And while some of us might do a good job in our early years providing for ourselves to be secure, I've talked to so many elderly people who say, yeah, I'm retired, I have money, I have a home, I have my family, I have security, but I'm wrestling with my significance. I'm wrestling with the second half of my life because I'm not sure what my purpose really is. And that's where we find Samson in his life, not living out God's purpose. And that's the challenge to each and every one of us when Paul says there is a temptation that is common to each and every one of us. That we would not simply be satisfied with the good life, and we have a good life that God has provided. But we would be constantly challenging ourselves, asking the question not only what is human flourishing, but am I flourishing in the way that God has called me to live my life that I might make a difference according to His purpose? And Samson fails over and over and over again. Not only does he fail to rise up to the call of being a deliverer for Israel, but in his own life, tragically it ends with the recognition that he doesn't finish well. And I think for all of us, while maybe some of us have gotten a good start, for all of us we're asking the question, how do I finish well? What does that mean for each and every one of us? What is God calling me to do now so at the end of the day, the treasure that I am accumulating is one of loving my neighbor and making a difference in the world? And so Samson goes down here and he finds himself in this place where, verse 2, the people of Gaza were told, Samson is here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn we will kill him. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the two posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Even in that place, he rises up. He grabs these gates. Do you know what they think these gates weighed? 2 tons. When's the last time you raised up 2 tons over your head? That just doesn't happen. 2 tons. Not only 2 tons, guess how far away Hebron was? 4 miles. So Samson rips out the gate. And it gives us a picture. Because I know that the Philistines assumed that their gate was the very thing that would keep him in check and that they would be able to pounce on him, because gates were the place where people would have to go through, and many of the folks in that civilization depending on their gates for protection. Well, Samson rips the gate out, puts it over his head, and goes to the next town. And again, we get a glimpse of God still providing Samson with the strength that is necessary. And so we'll go to verse 4, and now we find this whole process of Delilah. Verse 4, sometime later, here he is again, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek. Some people call this he-man a she-man, simply because he had this she-man problem. And you wonder in our culture if we don't see that all the time as well. So he goes to this valley, it's interesting. The woman is in the valley of Sorek. Sorek was the valley of the best wine in that era, like the Willamette Valley. And so here again, he's going to a place that is forbidden to him, finds a woman that is outside of his marriage, and finds himself in a place where he's going to be compromised over and over again. And so he goes there and finds this woman, Delilah. And then the rulers come of the Philistines, and they go to her and say, see if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Now, we don't have a real understanding of that, but when you think about it, 10 pieces of silver was the annual wage of a person in that day. They were willing to give her 1,100 pieces of silver each, 5 of them, which made for 5,500 pieces of silver, which was 550 times the amount of money that a person would get in a year. Talk about a retirement plan. So her issue was money. His issue, Samson, was sex. Sex and money were going to be the downfall of this man who was called and raised up by God to make a difference. And so she says to him, oh, Samson, if you really love me, would you tell me what is the source of your strength? And so they have that conversation. And he says to her, if anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man. He lies to her. So she thinks she's got it. So he goes to sleep. She tells the Philistines. They're hiding in the room. She says quickly, quick, Samson, the Philistines are here. And he jumps up, he breaks the bowstrings, and he drives them all out. Now, you'd think he'd realize, well, maybe not. Love is blind, right? He'd realize that she's in it for some other reason. So she says to him, you deceived me. Could you tell me again? And so he goes on, and verse 13, then Delilah said to Samson, all this time you have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Isn't it interesting in a relationship like that, we would be surprised that we're being lied to? So he says, tell me how you can be tied, she says again. He replied, well, if you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric of the loom and tighten with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man. So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Again she called him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep, pulled up the pin from the loom and the fabric with the fabric. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So, verse 17, he told her everything. Don't you at a certain point in the story ask yourself the question, Samson, what's wrong with you? But Samson has this arrogance to him. You'd think he'd get out of there. You remember Forrest Gump? I couldn't help when I read this one, run, Forrest, run, Forrest, run. And certainly you read the New Testament, it's filled with the command, flee. Flee your morality. Flee your lustful flesh. Flee materialism. Flee all of it. Get out of town. And yet Samson seems to be clueless that Delilah does not have his best interest in mind. And already 3 times, while the Philistines are in the room, he's having it with Delilah, who ends up tying him up a number of times, and then the Philistines come. It's almost like he relishes in this insanity. But only the 3rd time, he tells her, if my head were shaved, verse 17, so he told her everything, No razor has ever been used on my head, he said, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head was shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. So you find him now. Remember, think about the Nazaritic vow, right? Don't drink fermented drink. He simply complied and violated that. Don't get close to dead stuff. He's violated that. The only thing he hasn't finally given prey to is the acknowledgement of his hair being the very thing that provides him with strength. And now, blind to his lust, willing to give up ultimately that which he's been consecrated to, he's willing to let her shave his head. Do you see the slippery slope? In my concern for myself and for all of us, that it's not often that we find ourselves engaging in the big sin. It's why the writer of Proverbs says, listen, if you have a problem with the prostitute, don't go by her house. No, better still, don't go by her street. That there is this slippery slope where little by little it erodes, it's being nibbled at. And we find ourselves making small decisions that ultimately end up being big decisions. Do you ever notice why the writer of Proverbs calls sin backsliding? Because it's not running. It's not walking. It's slipping away. And we make those little decisions like Samson, and we're slipping away. It starts with a thought, an attitude that maybe is expressed in a word, that ultimately is a deed, that ultimately becomes a habit, that ultimately becomes character, that ultimately leads us down a path where we're no longer living according to God's purpose. And so like Samson, we too have been called to be deliverers. Like Samson, we too find ourselves wrestling with our own addictions and absorptions, where we make security and significance more important than the very call of God in our lives. That's why Paul says these things were written for our learning. It's not that we just go to church and listen to a good sermon. We ask ourselves, where's my slippery slope? Where do I at times placate the Word of God? Where do I at times find my thoughts wandering, my words being anything but encouraging, and the deeds be anything but caring for my brothers and sisters? And so Samson finds himself in this place. Samson is, in a sense, had enough. And so notice verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she went to the rulers of the Philistines. Come back once more. He has told me everything. So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him. And notice the last words, and his strength left him. You see, when we read this story, it's first sin finds that which is a feeble attempt to have sin be satisfied. So sin is crouching at the door, God said to Cain. And sin is crouching at all of our doors. And I'm sure the devil, while he's not omniscient or doesn't know all things, he certainly knows enough where he knows, if you've ever read the Screw Tape Letters, he knows those areas in our life where sin crouches. And so sin is always looking for an opportunity to keep us from the fullness that God has provided for us. And so what will end up happening here is first sin finds us. But now we're going to find out that sin will also bind us. Because as Samson is without his strength, the Philistines come And look what happens, verse 20. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shall shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Do you hear that? But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And sometimes in our lives, when we stop being sensitive to the Spirit of God and stop being sensitive to our time with God and stop caring whether we read the Word or pray or spend time in that relationship that deepens our intimacy with Him. Do you remember when Jacob was in that place? He went out from the presence of the Lord and he didn't even know it. And sometimes we can get so used to the life that we live as followers of Christ and not recognize that we're on this slippery slope moving farther and farther away. And all of a sudden, not only does sin find its place in Samson's life, but sin now binds him. Look at verse 21. Then the Philistines seized him. So sin not only finds, but sin binds. And then notice it says, and they gouged out his eyes. You see the slope? Sin finds, sin binds, sin blinds. And then it says, and they took him down to Gaza, binding him with bronze shackles. They set him to grinding grain in the prison. I mean, you could just take that verse and you could preach it. Sin finds, sin blinds, sin binds, and sin grinds. And it is that slippery slope that he finds himself on. And it is important that you understand something. We are not punished for our sin. We are punished by our sin. Because sin is what undermines us. Sin is what eats at us. Sin is what removes us from the place of the relationships that are so helpful. A loving God, He doesn't let us experience it because He wants to hurt us. He recognizes we're being hurt because of what happens, and because He loves us, He wants to use it. As James says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials and temptations, because it's in these places of want, it's in these places of emptiness, it's in these places of vulnerability, it's in these places of God-given honesty where we cry out. I don't know about you, but it's in those moments of desperation where it seems like I'm finally ready to listen to God. When I've had enough of myself and enough of my sin that's found me and binding me and blinding me and grinding me, and I'm trying to work out my life. And the more I do it, so I don't know what it is for you. I don't know whether it's sex or money or prestige or possessions. It's all a part of that which is constantly trying to come after us, blinding us from the things that God would want to work in our life. And now Samson, who has been blind figuratively speaking, is now blind physically speaking. Because sin, someone once said that sin, spelled S-I-N, is self-inflicted nonsense. Because we live our life in a way that we fall so far outside of the reality that God has created for us when we talk about human flourishing. Could anybody have had more promise than Samson? And he had more promise than OJ. And we could go through a list of individuals who have found themselves with such an unbelievable start and such a devastating and destructive finish. And so you find Samson here, verse 22, as he's grinding. Remember, they take him down the gate, so they make him a mule. And he's going around in that big thing of grinding the grain, blind and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And all of a sudden, verse 22 says, but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Could God be any more gracious? Could God Does grace be any more sufficient? Could he be any more than the God of the second chance and the third chance and the fourth chance and the fifth chance? Our God? How many of us would have given up on Samson? Oh boy, not this again, Samson. And yet you read that verse and you say, Samson, sin, finding and blinding and binding and grinding, and then but God. But his hair grows again. It reminds me of what Paul says to the Ephesians. He said, all of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh, chapter 2, verse 3 of Ephesians, and following its desires and thoughts. You could put Samson's picture, or you could put our picture there. He says, all of us, like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But guess what verse 4 says? But, like Samson, but the hair of his head began to grow again. It says, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. Yes, grace and mercy is God's heart towards a sinful people. But make no mistake, while grace and mercy will be made available to us over and over and over again, Samson's still blind. You see, because the wages of sin and the consequences of sin can have devastating results in our lives. And they might rob us of what it means to finish well and fulfill the full purpose of God. But God. But God. But God in His incredible long-suffering, God in His incredible grace, but God in His incredible mercy begins to move again in Samson's life. In verse 23 of 16 it says, now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson our enemy into our hands. Do you see the absurdity of the Philistines? How often it is that we attribute our success, our goodness, our life, our blessing, even as we live in this wonderful land of ours, to the things that we've provided and to the gods that we've created. They're celebrating because they believe Dagon has provided them with Samson. The foolishness of thinking that without God nothing happens. Our God. And Samson is not the end result of Dagon providing them, Philistines, with victory. Samson is simply a revelation of the consequences of not living the consecrated life that God has called us to. Because the wages of sin will be death. And I'm not talking about heaven or hell. I'm talking about the death of the purpose that God has for our lives. And without but grace, but God, but mercy, we're left to our own devices. And so he goes on, then Samson prayed to the Lord. So they gathered Samson around, celebrating this victory, so-called. So in verse 24, when the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. When I remember this once when I was brand new believer, and I ended up going home and sitting with my dad and my stepmom and at the table, and I said, I want to pray for this meal. I was a new believer, and my dad said, why? I'm the one that put the food on the table. And in my mind I think, oh man, if you only knew who put the food on the table and who has brought your son home to share it with you. And I think that's the way these Philistines are, and that's the way that we can feel without God. And so they bring him in verse 25. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. Now that which was called by God to deliver Israel has been nothing more than a puppet for the enemy. Instead of Samson delivering Israel and moving the Philistines out, the Philistines are moving the Israelites out. And it goes on and says, so they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. And when they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were, and 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. So here are these thousands of people mocking Samson, and in a sense mocking God. And the whole time Samson's hair has been growing again. And notice what Samson does. And he doesn't need eyes to do it. Then Samson prayed. Isn't it true? Some of our most powerful prayers come from our moments when we're the most blind, when the most vulnerable, the most struggling in terms of worlds. And he prays, Sovereign Lord. Isn't it interesting? Sovereign Lord. You hear what Samson's acknowledging? God, you're in control of all things. And while he's recognizing the sovereignty of God, he's got to be confronted with the fact that he's been taking life into his own hands over and over and over again. But you don't need eyes to recognize. For that matter, faith sees what lots of people with eyes don't see. And he prays, and he cries out, and he recognizes, even as he calls him Sovereign Lord. He says, remember me, please, God. Strengthen me just once more. And let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all of his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Samson had been given so much. And it took this, in a sense, for him to recognize the sovereignty of God in his life. That's the question that we should be asking ourselves. What will it take for you and I to recognize that God is sovereign? Ain't no politics, ain't no COVID, ain't no family grumbling, ain't no financial difficulty, ain't no house in the woods. Nothing is going to separate us, as Paul says. If God be for us, Romans 8 and 31, if God be for us, who can be against us? Not death, not life, not principality, not powers, not things to come, not things that have already gone. God, if he didn't, and this is where Samson is a picture of us. I don't know where you are in your life, but one of the things I'm thinking about is, as I was talking to Bruce, and we were talking about this, and Bruce said this. He said, it may be that you know all too well what it is to feel as Samson felt. You have fallen under temptation, and you would be ashamed if anyone knew the details of it. There's a bumper sticker that puts it beautifully. Christians aren't perfect, they're forgiven. There's another one that says, I'm not perfect, but God's not finished with me yet. The hair can grow again. Some of you literally would love that, I'm sure. Especially Jim Gurney and John Anthony, but we won't go there. But think about it. No matter where you have found yourself, even in your failure, but God. And so while we look at the story of Samson and it seems to end with such heartache, it also, again, highlights the fact that while Judges had all these deliverers, none of them could ultimately deliver the people of God. While at the same time they all point to a greater deliverer. His name is Jesus. And he too allowed himself to be bound by the sins of humanity and nailed to a cross and took all the burden of humanity upon himself. And it was there, like Samson, he died. But our God was raised from the dead to ultimately deliver you and I from the greatest enemy we would ever face, ourselves and our self-absorption. Is it any wonder that when we go to the book of Hebrews, it's interesting when we go to Hebrews, let me read to you Hebrews 32. It says, it talks about these heroes of faith. And what more shall I say? It's the faith chapter. I do not have time to tell about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign enemies. Verse 39 of 11 says, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Do you see what the writer of Hebrews is saying? It's saying Gideon and Jephthah and Barak and Deborah and Samson. These are the heroes of faith who, while at moments in life they failed miserably, the end word that God brings to us about them is that they were heroes in faith because they went out believing. God sees the heart of Samson in the midst of it. God sees the heart of David in the midst of it. And then he says, they all point to Jesus. It goes on, it says, these cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Life is full of setbacks and full of trouble. And sometimes trouble stings us so deeply that we have such a heartfelt discouragement that we wonder whether we'll ever make it. May Samson point to our deliverance. Despite the foolishness of Samson, Samson once again reminds us that there was a deliverer to come. We call him Jesus. It is he who has given us, given you, given me, given us a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance, and a fifth chance. And we find ourselves even in this world where everyone is still doing what's right in their own eyes. God's not through with us yet. And so while we have breath to breathe and eyes to see and hearts that pump and hands to administer, may we be the people who feed those who are hungry, who clothe those who are naked, who visit those who are in the hospital sick, who visit those who are in the prisons. And may we learn from all of these judges who God has called, not so much that they would simply be recognized as deliverers of Israel, but so that God could be exposed as the one who is the God of the second chance, but God, who is rich in mercy with a great love wherewith he loves us. Despite our failure, day after day after day, will say to us, as he said to the prophet Jeremiah, God's mercies are new every morning. Whatever your failure has been, may your hair grow. May you experience his power. May you lean into his grace. And while I pray our life is not the bitter ending of a Samson, I pray that these things that were written, we would learn from them so that we could be deliverers with a small d to a land that is struggling to find itself. In Jesus' name, let's pray. Father, thank you.